In the early 2010s, PEI was set to partner with a UK company to build a lucrative hub that would combine online gaming regulation with a global financial processing center. A positive relationship was built between business and government, with meetings held over golf games and afternoons at five-star hotels. And then, suddenly, it all fell apart. How PEI tried and ultimately failed to build this gaming and financial hub is a story that could only happen in Canada's smallest province, where everyone who's rich and powerful knows everyone else, and is no more than 2 steps removed from someone in the government. The seemingly harmless nature of the business deal behind it all is in stark opposition to the lies, secrets, and cover-ups that have come to define PEI's e-gaming scandal. In 2008, the province's then finance minister issued a report that advised that the rise of unregulated online gambling could threaten the profitability of the province's racetracks and casinos. PEI is small, at the time only about 145,000 people, which made the way forward unclear. In Canada, gambling is regulated by the provinces. Even with online gambling, an online casino can only be used by people living in that province. So even if PEI was able to establish an e-gaming hub, for it to be truly profitable, they would need to attract people from other provinces. But that's illegal. It was actually Don McKenzie, the executive director and legal counsel for the Micmac Confederacy in PEI, who brought a proposal to the province in 2009, based off of another Indigenous community in Montreal. The Kanawake Reserve had been running a gambling operation for years that normally would have been considered illegal, by asserting their right to self-govern, as First Nations rights supersede the Canadian Criminal Code. This gave the province a potential loophole. If they could establish the e-gaming hub on Indigenous land, they could attract users from other provinces without technically breaking the law. At least that was the theory. The province agreed to look into it, as long as it was done quietly. The gaming committee slowly grew, starting with just Don McKenzie, then Finance Minister Wes Sheridan, and his Deputy Minister Paul Jelly. They added a Charlottetown law firm, McInnes Cooper, in 2010, and then soon realized none of them actually had the know-how to pull something like this off. The way they connected with someone who could pull it off goes like this. Paul Maines was the VP of Business Development of a company called Capital Markets Technologies, or CMT. CMT had an approximately 30% stake in a company called Simplex. Simplex was based in the UK. It made technology that allowed a lot of money to be moved securely, and they were looking to expand into North America. PEI was a great potential spot. It's about as close to Europe as you can get in Canada, and the PEI government offered plenty of lucrative incentives to businesses like Simplex. Paul Maines had dinner with his cousin's new boyfriend, someone named Garth Jenkins. Him and his brother Paul had a close relationship with a financial broker at RBC named Shane McEachern. Shane's wife Melissa was the Deputy Minister of Tourism for the PEI government, and Shane apparently golfed with Premier Giz fairly frequently. Soon, Maines, the Jenkins, and the CEO of Simplex were meeting semi-regularly to figure out how to create a global transaction hub in PEI. They agreed they needed local representation on the island, so Paul Jenkins became the sole director of a PEI subsidiary of CMT, a numbered corporation called 7645686. Through the Jenkins and McEachern, CMT was able to get meetings with the government, and it was in the course of those discussions that the CMT team learned of the government's plan to create a center to regulate e-gaming in the country. Eureka! CMT, known as FMT on the island, could combine their global transaction hub with the government's e-gaming initiative. Now that they had a positive connection with the government, CMT started raising money. They were not a publicly traded company, so they raised money through convertible loan agreements, with the understanding that once they went public, those loans would be converted to shares. Now, the process of going public is difficult and complicated, but there's a way around that, something called a reverse takeover. That's when a private company buys a major stake in a public company and merges the two. It basically allows a private company to move into the shell of a public company and skip the whole process of going public. And that's exactly what CMT had planned to do. They had already chosen a Toronto-based company, Revolution Technologies, that was a penny stock, which they intended to purchase once the hub was up and running. Paul Jenkins invested about $45,000 not into CMT, but directly into Revolution Technologies. Christine DePratt, the wife of Chris Leclerc, the then Premier's Chief of Staff, purchased $1,500 worth of shares in Revolution Technologies. Those shares were nearly worthless at the time, but if everything went according to plan, they would pay out famously. But this investment, according to the Attorney General, is at the very least a conflict of interest. Leclerc at first denied that his wife had heard of the investment opportunity from Paul Jenkins, but in a sworn affidavit, did acknowledge that Jenkins had tipped him off about the opportunity. That's more or less what we call insider trading. At almost every stage of the saga, the government demonstrated a preference for secrecy and a disregard for the public. At the beginning of the process, the province gave a loan of $950,000 to the Micmac Confederacy that would be repaid by the profits of the e-gaming hub. What that money really went to was research and development costs of the hub. The loan was originally going to be almost $1.2 million, but loans over $1 million have to be made public, and so it was reduced. In total, the government spent at least $1.5 million on the failed initiative. The majority of that money didn't even go to the Micmac Confederacy. It went to McInnes Cooper for professional fees. Nevertheless, by 2011, a plan was in place that would see the global transaction platform up and running by the end of 2012. The plan had two options. A, the province was able to become a regulatory hub, where other provinces would pay them licensing fees, and if that didn't work, then B, they would host the hub on Indigenous land, bypassing the Canadian Criminal Code. But of course, neither of those things happened. At this point, this entire professional business operation involving government, international corporations, and local business people devolves into what feels like a high school feud. There are a lot of moving parts, but I'll try to keep it simple. A financial advisor at Scotiabank in Charlottetown, Yusuf Hashmi, had a number of clients who were involved in some way with CMT. In one case, Hashmi tried to talk one of his clients out of investing in the company. In Hashmi's eyes, a reverse takeover always means a scam, and he didn't like what he'd heard about CMT. Separate to the financial hub, Simplex was working with the government on a tourism-based loyalty card system. They hired Eddie Francis to help sell the program to local businesses. Francis was also one of Hashmi's clients. Hashmi had a meeting with Paul Maines and Eddie Francis. Francis was concerned about rumors that Hashmi might have been spreading about CMT and Simplex that were making it harder for him to sell the loyalty program. After that meeting, Hashmi shared information about Francis's investments with his branch manager, Eddie Curran. Curran and Hashmi then also contacted the branch manager at the Charlottetown RBC to discuss their concerns about clients who had invested with CMT. Around the same time, the government had been told that their e-gaming plans would officially violate the criminal code and decided to abandon that part of the operation. However, they still wanted to go ahead with Simplex's financial transaction center as well as the loyalty card. As they were working on the loyalty program, Simplex was waiting on $50,000 from the government and $60,000 from McInnes Cooper, both who were increasingly late on paying them. By April 2012, Simplex still hadn't been paid and was getting frustrated. They and CMT decided to look elsewhere and began negotiations with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in July. But before they could make significant progress, Premier Robert Giz said that he personally wanted the transaction management platform to be in PEI and told CMT to submit a memorandum of understanding that would be signed immediately. And they did. The MOU had an exclusivity period as long as it was in effect, meaning CMT or the government could not engage in the same business with other parties. It originally had a date of 60 days, but was extended because a member of the government was at a CrossFit competition. CMT, thinking things were on their way, started hiring consultants in PEI to help with the project. But it turned out Wes Sheridan and Chris Leclerc hadn't been told the MOU had been extended, and thinking it had expired, they had already started talking to other financial services companies in Europe to do the work. At the same time, Eddie Curran contacted a man named Stephen Dowling, the General Counsel for the Consumer, Labor, and Financial Services Division of the Department of Environmental Labor and Justice, to request a meeting. In that meeting, Curran accused CMT of suspicious trading and advising activity. Nevertheless, CMT attempted to close the deal later that month as laid out in the MOU, but were unable to do so, as the meeting with Dowling led to the Superintendent of Securities launching a formal investigation against CMT. That investigation was being conducted by Dowling himself. Maine's lawyer was told that the nature of the complaint was that CMT was attempting to sell fraudulent securities in the PEI market, influence government officials, swindle money for fraudulent purposes from sick people, misuse its own trust funds, and maintain an inappropriate business relationship with RBC Dominion. Allegedly, there was a woman with cancer who had put all her RRSP into CMT. That woman didn't exist, by the way. Without CMT's knowledge, Brad Mix, a member of the PEI government, had told a number of CMT's clients he would be at a major trade show in Japan that year as a payments expert to recruit companies to PEI. Basically, Mix was intending to use CMT's name and reputation to score meetings. At that point, Simplex and CMT were ready to walk away from the province entirely. And I don't blame them. Throughout the time the MOU was suspended, the government made a series of strange choices that seemed to be designed not to resolve the investigation, but specifically to discredit CMT. When the Superintendent of Securities announced the investigation, rather than posting it on their website as is customary, Dowling spread a press release to every media member in the Maritimes. Wes Sheridan made a number of absurd claims over the years. He denied the government had ever signed an MOU with CMT, said the Micmac Confederacy was controlling the gaming file despite the fact that Sheridan himself was leading the gaming committee. He said he didn't know that Simplex and CMT were connected, and they weren't involved in any of the government's work. Sheridan resigned not long after that interview. In February of 2013, CMT sought an end to the MOU so they could move on, but PEI refused. The government continued to delay any hearings in the case. Some theorized because they were afraid of having government officials cross-examined, and so finally CMT decided to settle and pay a $10,000 fine and $5,000 in legal fees so they could walk away. The Superintendent of Securities had the file for the investigation sealed, which is not common practice. An Auditor General report came out in 2016 with some further concerning discoveries. The government is required to archive government emails. Those emails are available to the public through Freedom of Information requests. But years of emails belonging to Leclerc, as well as 2 other government officials involved in the e-gaming initiative, were deleted. A court ruled that there was no proof the government had done that to intentionally hide anything, although how exactly you prove that, I don't know. Why exactly the government put so much effort into developing a relationship with Simplex and CMT, only to sabotage it from the inside and then deny it ever happened, is still largely a mystery. But I have a theory, and it's based on something I haven't told you yet. All the way back at the beginning, you may remember, the Jenkins brought in their broker friend Shane McEachern, who had connections with the government. McEachern became the money man for the operation. He approached his bosses at RBC about being the broker of record for CMT and was told no, not until CMT went public. However, McEachern went ahead and did it anyway in secret. In many cases, it was McEachern and not Paul Maines soliciting investments into CMT. One of the charges against Paul Maines is that he solicited investments from unaccredited investors. CMT had been provided official documentation from RBC, by way of McEachern, that each investor signed, stipulating they were accredited. But in reality, McEachern couldn't have issued those documents in any official capacity, as he was working in defiance of his compliance officer. In 2014, McEachern was fined $25,000, as well as a number of other stipulations, yet this was not widely reported. Dowling's investigation mainly pinned those things on Maines, publicly discrediting him for something someone else had done. Here's how I think this may have played out. Hashmi, a close friend of Chris Leclerc, and Curran brought their concerns to RBC, who started looking into their clients with investments in CMT. During that investigation, it was discovered that McEachern was soliciting investments into CMT, violating securities regulations, and possibly being a conflict of interest considering his wife's position in the government. From there, news spread, and the Jenkins, Chris Leclerc, Wes Sheridan, and other government officials realized that their investments and involvement with CMT were a scandal waiting to happen, with a lot of intimate connections to the government all the way up to Premier Giz. And so a simple plan was formed. Pin the illegal investments on Paul Maines and publicly discredit him and his company, sever connections with CMT, delete emails, bring in another company, and try to get their money back. Which they did, by the way. Anyone who wanted their investment back from CMT got it, with 12% interest. Now maybe that all feels like an outlandish conspiracy theory. Maybe the truth is simply that people got cold feet when Hashmi brought up concerns over CMT's reverse takeover plans. Maybe CMT and the government just couldn't get over the finish line. Business relationships can be extremely complicated. But business deals like this fall through all the time. The PEI government only paid Simplex about $60,000 in the end. Barely a drop in the bucket, and certainly not a scandal on its own. So either something else happened, that government officials and PEI business people wanted to stay hidden, Or prominent members of the government involved with the e-gaming initiative told bold-faced lies about objective, easily proven facts, initiated an investigation into a company that had received no complaints from its actual investors, abandoned a business project they'd been working on for 2 years for no clear reason, accidentally deleted mountains of emails related to the case, and publicly smeared CMT and Paul Maines, all just by coincidence. In the end, all of that simply doesn't add up to something simple and easily explained for the PEI government. What does remain is a court case that is finally going to trial after several appeals that will determine officially if PEI is guilty of breaking the MOU, or if that too was all just a coincidence.